The new hours of service rules are relatively simple once you understand them and how to calculate your legal driving times. State laws may differ slightly, but these are the requirements established by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. Driving a tractor-trailer rig is a stressful job, sometimes more so than others. The purpose of the hours of service regulations is to reduce the number of accidents resulting from driver fatigue. When a driver thinks he is invincible and pushes himself beyond his ability to think clearly and react quickly, that's when bad accidents happen. That's when deaths occur. A driver who deprives himself of essential rest is simply an accident looking for a place to happen. These regulations were developed because, over time, both drivers and the companies they worked for tried to push the limit with horrible results. A rested driver is an alert driver. If you take a life in an accident because of fatigue, you'll never live it down. Let's start with the 11-hour rule. The rules state, a property-carrying commercial motor vehicle driver may drive a maximum of 11 hours following 10 consecutive hours off duty. The window within which a driver may operate his property-carrying CMV is 14 hours. Within that 14-hour window, the driver is permitted to drive up to 11 hours following 10 hours of off-duty time. To further illustrate this rule, let's say a driver comes on duty at 8 a.m. after being off for 10 hours. That driver has from 8 a.m. until 10 p.m. to complete his driving day. That's a 14-hour window. Within those 14 hours, the driver may drive up to a total of 11 hours. It doesn't matter how many hours the driver actually drives up to 11. Once the clock strikes 10 p.m. or the 14th hour, driving is over for that day. Driving beyond the 14th hour is a violation. This is a very simple concept. Once on duty, a driver must complete all his driving during the next 14 hours. If a driver comes on duty at 2 a.m., all driving must stop at 4 p.m. That's 14 hours later. If a driver comes on duty at 5 a.m., all driving must stop at 7 p.m., 14 hours later. And within that 14-hour window, a driver must not drive more than 11 hours. Keep in mind that coming on duty to drive must be preceded by at least 10 hours of off-duty time. Let's review the 760-870 rule. That is 60 hours of duty over 7 days or 70 duty hours over 8 days. A driver may drive a maximum of 11 hours after 10 consecutive hours off duty. Also, when a driver comes on duty, a 14-hour clock is started. A driver may not drive beyond the 14th hour after coming on duty following 10 consecutive hours off duty. The 760-870 rule states as follows. The property-carrying CMV driver may not drive after 60 to 70 hours of duty in 7-8 consecutive days. A driver may restart a 7-8 consecutive day period after taking 34 or more consecutive hours off duty. We'll use two forms to illustrate how this works: a driver's daily log sheet and a month log summary sheet. The rules state a driver may not drive after 60 to 70 hours of duty in 7-8 consecutive days. Here, the word duty is critical. Duty means work, being on the job. Looking at a daily log sheet, there are 4 rows a driver uses to document time. The first and second rows are labeled off-duty and sleeper berth. In the 760-870 rules, they are considered off-duty time. The next 2 rows are labeled driving and on-duty. Both of these are used to record duty under this rule. The second form is the monthly log summary sheet. In this example, we'll use the 870 rule. A driver starts work at 8 a.m. Monday morning. The 14-hour rule says that all driving must be completed no more than 14 hours later or by 10 p.m. that night. Let's say he was a fairly ambitious driver and he went through his first 7 days as follows. The first through the 4th day, the driver was on the job, both driving and doing other work 10 hours a day. The 5th and the 6th days, he worked 5 hours each. The 7th day, he drove another 10 hours. How many hours can he drive on the 8th day? You would add up the last 7 days, which would total 60 hours of work. Notice I said work, not just driving. Then you subtract these 60 hours from a possible 70 available hours. You see that the driver can work another 10 hours on the 8th day. The driver's total in-duty time for the last 8 days totals 70 hours. Now how many hours can he drive the following day? Count backwards 7 days from today. Subtract that number from 70, and you'll find that tomorrow you'll have 10 hours available to work. Before we get too far ahead, you notice we have 2 days back-to-back where only 5 hours were worked. If you examine the driver's logbook, you'll see that the driver came to work at 7 p.m. the first evening and was on duty until 5 a.m. the next morning. He spent half his duty hours on duty one day and the rest the next day. Even though he was working 10 straight hours, the hours fell within 2 different days, 5 in one and 5 in the other. Okay, let's go back to the 760-870 rule. Even though the driver had 10 hours available, he only worked 5. What happens when you either violate the rule or get all 70 hours in by the 7th day? Following the 5-hour day, the driver worked 15 hours. He didn't necessarily drive 15 hours, but he was on duty 15 hours. How many hours can he drive the next day? Count backwards 7 days. Subtract from 70, and there you have it. He can drive 10 hours the next day. Then, he put in another 15-hour day. Now suppose the driver put in another 15-hour day of driving and other work. What then? When you add it up, you find that he is 5 hours over, or he has a minus 5 hours available to drive. Then he cannot drive the next day at all. Enter a 0 in the hours worked today column. How about the next day? Count backwards 7 days, add up the hours, and subtract from the 70. The total is 70 hours available minus 70 hours of work. 0 hours are available to work the next day. So the driver has missed 2 days of work because of going over the 870 rule. Of course, by now, the driver has been off work for 34 hours and can reset the timetable. That is, start off fresh if he or she wants to. If a driver manages time properly, he or she can work for a long time without a break due to a violation. Manage your time right, and you'll have a smooth ride. Let's now review the sleeper berth provision. This provision is stated by the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Division as follows. CMV drivers using the sleeper berth provisions must take at least 8 consecutive hours in the sleeper berth, plus 2 consecutive hours either in the sleeper berth, off-duty, or any combination of the two. What does this mean? Before elaborating on this provision, let's summarize the other rules affecting the hours of service, and keep in mind whichever rule is fulfilled first determines when a vehicle operator must stop driving. When a driver comes on duty, a 14-hour clock is started. When the 14th hour of on-duty is reached, driving stops. Within that 14-hour clock, a driver may drive his or her vehicle up to 11 hours following 10 hours of off-duty time. When the 11th hour is reached, driving stops. The next rule is the 60 hours in 7 days or 70 hours in 8 days rule. This states when a driver reaches 60 hours on duty within a 7-day period or 70 hours on duty within an 8-day period, driving must stop. The sleeper berth provision takes into consideration all of the other rules, but has a slight twist. The twist is this. Under the sleeper berth provision, a driver may split his or her rest time hours. You remember, the 11-hour rule states that the driver must take 10 consecutive hours off duty before starting 11 potential hours of driving. With the sleeper berth provision, a driver can rest in his or her sleeper berth for 8 consecutive hours, then drive for a few hours and take at least 2 more hours off duty either in the berth, off duty, or a combination of both. This validates and satisfies the 10-hour off-duty requirements. A critical part of this rule is compliance with the 11-hour and 14-hour rules, which are recalculated from the end of the first of the 2 periods used to obtain the 10 hours off-duty requirement. For example, a driver rests in his sleeper berth for 8 hours and then drives 4 hours. After 4 hours of driving, the driver takes 2 more hours off duty. This validates 10 hours of off-duty time, and the 14-hour clock can be restarted. However, it now starts from the end of the first rest period. Let's look at some logbook examples from the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration Rulebook. In the first example, on day 1, the driver was off-duty 10 hours, then began driving at 10 a.m. Driving stopped at 7 p.m., at which time the driver went to his sleeper berth for 8 hours. This took him into day 2. Beginning at 3 a.m., the driver drove 2 hours and went off-duty at 5 a.m. for 2 hours, validating a 10-hour off-duty requirement to recalculate the 14-hour clock. But the clock is recalculated from the end of the first rest period, or 3 a.m. Driving must now be done between 3 a.m. and 5 p.m. Considering the driver has already driven 2 hours before recalculating the clock, 9 hours are available to drive before 5 p.m. Our driver drives until 3 p.m., then does an hour of on-duty work before going to the sleeper berth. Everything is in compliance. In this second example, the driver comes off duty at 2 a.m. and goes to his sleeper berth until 10 a.m. or 8 hours. He starts driving at 10 and his 14-hour clock is calculated from that point. He has until 12 midnight to drive. He drives until 4 p.m., then takes a sleeper berth break for 5 hours until 9 p.m. Going to his sleeper berth for 5 hours validates the 10 hours off-duty rule, but the 14-hour clock still calculated from the end of his first break. The drive time still must end at midnight. He drives from 9 p.m. till 11 and then does the other on-duty work. At 1 a.m., the driver starts driving again and is immediately in violation of the 14-hour rule. At 2 a.m., the driver goes off duty for 10 hours. He comes back on duty at 12 noon and drives straight through until midnight. He's now violated the 11-hour rule. After 10 hours off duty, driving should have been stopped at 11 p.m. The last example is more complicated. After 10 hours off duty, a driver begins driving at 10 a.m. and drives until 3 p.m. At 3 p.m., the driver takes a 7-hour break in the sleeper berth, then starts driving at 10 p.m. He drives 2 hours, then takes another sleeper berth break for 7 more hours. At 7 a.m., he starts driving again. He is immediately in violation of the 14-hour rule. Why? Because neither of his 7-hour sleeper berth breaks counted. The rule states a driver must take 8 full hours in the sleeper berth followed by at least 2 more hours in the berth or off duty before the 14-hour or 11-hour rule can be recalculated. Anything less than 8 hours on one of the breaks does not count. The driver continues driving until 1 p.m., but at 11 a.m. he violates the 11-hour rule. His driving hours are calculated from the end of the last validated rest period, which was 10 a.m. the previous day. Since that time, the driver drove 5 hours, from 10 a.m. until 3 p.m. the previous day, then 2 more hours, from 10 p.m. until midnight the previous day, now totaling 7 hours and leaving only 4 more to drive. He started driving again at 7 a.m. the second day, and by 11 a.m. he had fulfilled the maximum 11 hours of driving. The sleeper berth provision is a very slippery rule that can be very expensive if it's violated. It's critical that you always recalculate your 14-hour clock and 11-hour rule from the end of the first 2 break periods, and one of those 2 breaks must entail 8 consecutive hours spent in the sleeper berth. It might sound a bit complicated, but once you learn the rules and complete your logs properly, it's not that difficult. What is difficult is to be cited for a violation. There's no reason for that if you follow the rules.